This evening, for our Alden-Berg lecture, for the 7th Alden-Berg lecture, we have the treat of hearing from Richard White, speaking about his most recent book, The Republic for Which It Stands, the United States During Reconstruction and the Gilded Age, 1865 to 1896. Few historians have made history matter more than Richard White. His scholarship has transformed our understanding of American history from the colonial era to the present, especially as it has related to American Indians, the American West, and the American environment. I could add here his many awards that his books have won, the many prizes, the many fellowships he's won. I guess I'll just say the one. As the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, I think it should be clear to everyone that Richard White is like really smart. Richard White's The Republic for Which It Stands is the latest addition to the prestigious Oxford History of the United States series. One of the previous volumes in that series was authored by our own, where are you, Dan Howe? Thank you. Our own Dan Howe, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in History, an honor that has been bestowed on 4 of the 9 volumes in the series that have been published to date. And it would certainly be no surprise if, and entirely fitting, if Richard White's entry made it a fabulous 5. White's book is especially timely for us today, given the echoes between the era he studies and ours. More than a few commentators have asked if we're living in a new Gilded Age, and that I hope is a subject that we will take up tonight in part. I should add, following Richard White's lecture, we will have books available for purchase and signing. Please join me in welcoming Richard White.
Thank you, Steve. I will certainly be surprised if I get the Pulitzer Prize, I'll tell you that. Writing this book, The Republic for Which It Stands, which is about the first Gilded Age, while living in the modern one was one of the most disconcerting experiences I've ever had as an academic. My writing hours were filled with old debates over immigration, inequality, monopoly, American identity, environmentalism, politics, and governance. And my days were filled with contemporary debates over the same subjects. The ghosts of issues that agitated the 19th century refused to be stilled. Or rather, they did not seem to be ghosts at all. There's a great danger in being enmeshed in a history that seems so relevant. And the danger is that I wouldn't write history at all. I would not grasp the strangeness of the past because so much of it seemed so familiar. The stronger the parallels, the more I yearned for the pastness of the past, the things that set it apart from the present. I could joke about, and here I have to find the Gilded Age as being the golden age of facial hair. But even that, these are all American presidents of the Gilded Age. But even that hardly seems to be behind us. Chester A. Arthur, who I think takes the prize here. And after all, who am I to talk about the golden age of facial hair? But for all its current resonance, there are 2 parts of the first Gilded Age that seem to keep their distance from us. And these are what I want to emphasize tonight. I stress them because they seem unfamiliar, lost, even irrelevant parts of the past. But that's precisely because why they're so valuable. They provide us with alternate ways of being human. They provide us with a window on historical processes. If the first Gilded Age were just like the second Gilded Age, why should we bother to go back to the second Gilded Age at all? We could just study the times that we live in. We go back because there are things in the past that are invisible to us in the present. And the 2 Gilded Age concepts that best encapsulate the pastness of the past are first the idea of a competency, which is a word that's rarely used anymore. And the second is home, a very familiar word, but one whose meaning has been drained away. The two concepts were linked, and they cannot be understood in isolation. And this is one of my major points that I'll be coming back to. In studying the past and its relevance to the present, we can't just pluck out a set of American values and relocate them to our times. They're too sticky. Their meaning is too attached to other values to which they were connected. So what about a competency? What was a competence or a competency? It was a value opposed to our picture of the Gilded Age. We think of the Gilded Age as the age of plutocracy. We think of it as a period of American history where the only desire of Americans was to achieve great wealth. But most people did not desire that. Most people desired a competency. And the easiest way to explain the concept is to turn to a figure who died at the beginning of my book, but who's resurrected at the end, in the picture, in the statue of Abraham Lincoln in Lincoln Park in Chicago. Lincoln begins my book in a way I'll come back to, and he ends my book. Lincoln is from Springfield, Illinois. Springfield, Illinois is a town which was devoted to the idea of a competency. One of the most eloquent documents in American history is the manuscript census for Springfield, Illinois in 1860, which is going to be the year that Lincoln, of course, is elected president. And there you can find Lincoln on Schedule 1, page 740. Abraham Lincoln, 51 years old, lawyer, owner of a home worth $5,000, $12,000 in personal property. Born in Kentucky, wife, 36-year-old Mary, no property listed, born in Kentucky. Two sons, Robert 16, Willie 9, both living with him, and two servants, M. Johnson, 18, female, and Philip Dinkle, 14, male. Above Lincoln on the list was a man named Lotus Niles, 40 years old, a secretary, which is the equivalent of a manager today. Born in New York, worth $9,500. Below him, Edward Biggs, 48-year-old, teamster from England, worth $4,300. 50-year-old Harry Corrigan, born in Ireland, and the richest man in the neighborhood with $30,000 in real estate. He ran a livery stable that his father owned. A few doors down was a bricklayer, Richard Ives, worth $12,000. All of these men had achieved a competence, the ability to support a family and have enough in reserve to sustain it through hard times at an accustomed level of prosperity. Not everyone on the census schedule possessed the competence. Next door to the Lincolns lived D.J. Snow, his wife Margaret, and two sons, 4 and 2. No occupation, worth $350. Snow lacked a competence. But notably, he did not live separately from those who did. A competence was a concept that took root in a society that by our standards had relatively small distinctions in wealth. Lincoln was one of the richest men in Springfield, Illinois, but he was not very rich. Lincoln believed that a free labor society was what produced towns like Springfield. In 1860, he had told an audience in New Haven, Connecticut, quote, "I am not ashamed to confess that 25 years ago I was a hired laborer, mauling rails at work on a flatboat, just what might happen to any poor man's son. But in the free states, a man knew, quote, he can better his condition. There is no such thing as a free man being fatally fixed for life in the condition of a hired laborer. The man who labored for another last year, this year labors for himself, and next year he will hire others to labor for him. If a man continues through life in the condition of a hired laborer, it is not the fault of the system, but because of either a dependent nature which prefers it, or improvidence, folly, or singular misfortune. The free labor system, Lincoln said, opens the way for all, gives hope to all, and energy and progress and improvement of condition to all." After his death, Lincoln's personal trajectory from log cabin to the White House served as the apotheosis of free labor. Anything was supposedly possible for those who strived. What free labor assumed was widespread opportunity, and also a society of independent producers in a competitive economy, which lacked the so-called dangerous classes, the very rich and the very poor. A competence was not just an economic concept. The component of independence made it political and moral. To lack the ability to gain a competence was to fail to gain independence and to be denied full political participation in the American Republic. A slave was not independent, and neither were children, nor the vast majority of women who were subject to husbands and fathers. And although abolitionists tried to change the definition of free labor and independence to the freedom to sell one's labor on the market, wage labor remained antithetical to the idea of a competence. Many Americans had a fear of a society in which working for wages would threaten the independence, the livelihood, and the citizenship of American workers. A competence shaped what we have taken to calling the American dream. In this early version, Americans not only did not seek great wealth, they feared it. When a person through hard work or good fortune amassed enough to support himself and his family for a lifetime, he very often just retired. At age 29 in 1863, Charles Schofield, a successful textile manufacturer in Philadelphia and a Union veteran, sold his interest in a textile mill for $40,000 and, quote, retired with a competency. He considered himself, he said, opulent enough. That is the world that's going to vanish during the Gilded Age. A competence connects to my second Gilded Age concept, the home, which I make a central aspect of the book. Springfield, Illinois is going to be a town of homes. And Lincoln and Springfield provide a very good way to look at what home meant in the 19th century. Lincoln proved the great narrative challenge of writing this book. As I said, in many ways, he looms over the whole Gilded Age. He looms over Reconstruction. He was dead in 1865. As my editor, David Kennedy, pointed out to me, my chief character dies on the first page of my book. But I still had his corpse. And what I do is open the book with narrating Lincoln coming home to here, to Springfield, Illinois. This is his house in Springfield. This is going to be hung with black crepe, because he comes back to the region that produced him and the region that became identified with what Americans understood as home. Springfield, Illinois was Lincoln's home. It embodied a Midwestern ideal of roughly equal white men maintaining homes and families. Indeed, the simplest way to explain the goal of Reconstruction and the immediate post-war Republican Party is they wanted to turn the whole country into a series of Springfield, Illinois. And in Springfield in the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s, the home was everywhere. Methodist Bishop Matthew Simpson, who preached Lincoln's funeral service, put the president to rest figuratively as well as physically in the Midwestern prairie, for, quote, his home was in the growing West, the heart of the Republic. Lincoln came home, Simpson declared, not just to the prairie, but also to the people who would, quote, not be subject to tyrants or autocrats or to class rule of any kind. Similarly, Lincoln's friend James Mahaney had written in the Springfield City Directory of 1858, quote, every man in our midst who has evidenced a reasonable industry coupled with care and prudence has a home of his own, humble though it be. Yet nevertheless, it is a home, and no costly palace is more than that. The problem we face is that the word home today seems a pretty anodyne concept. But it was nothing of the sort in the 19th century. We think of it as the stuff of Currier and Ives lithographs. And it was, clearly, home sweet home. But at a time when such lithographs carried considerable cultural clout. Home was the central way that Americans understood and justified their society. The purpose of the economy was not to produce great wealth for individuals. The purpose of the economy was to secure people homes. And the point of homes was to reproduce Republican citizens on which the Republic depended. When we talked about a free labor society, they did not mean a collection of individuals. They meant a collection of families and homes. No concept was more important in the 19th century. In the book, I use it as a lens to understand American thinking about gender, immigration, urbanization, the economy, and politics. The 19th century home challenges the way we usually think about the Gilded Age as a period of individualism, as a period of small L liberalism, as a period of laissez-faire, and as a period of weak government. It was none of those things. Unlike classical liberalism, small L liberalism, which is today closer to libertarianism than modern liberalism, home values a collective interest over an individual interest. And the home challenges the value of the Central American figure being the isolate male, the individualist. It challenges laissez-faire because the government intervened in the economy repeatedly to secure homes. The Homestead Act, which promised every claimant, male and female, who intended to become a citizen, a farm home, was an iconic piece of Gilded Age legislation. Home-shaped ideals of manhood, which virtually always at the time, as I'll come back to, meant white manhood. A man was not just a male. A man was someone who could support a family and create a home. And if you did not support a family and create a home, you were not, in their sense, a man. It also shaped ideas of womanhood. To be a woman was to be somebody who reproduced and nurtured a family. Again, as the Midwest embodied this idea of roughly white men and women creating homes and families. As people aged in the 1870s and 1880s, publishing companies used to send out solicitors who would go door to door, selling county histories, which became known as mug books. This is a slide from a mug book. To be part of a mug book, what you did is you gave them an account of your life. And the accounts of these lives are virtually always the same if you begin to go through these mug books, which exist for California as well as the Midwest. And they always told the same story. They told the story of the creation of a home. They start, as you can see here, with the old homestead built in 1833, a cabin in the woods. That's the beginning of an American life, the beginning of an American trajectory. This is the end of it. The established farm, prosperity, a competency. These paired pictures capture the trajectory of American lives and how Americans understood their achievement. Their achievement should be the creation of a family, a home, and a competency. Out of these would arise the reproduction of the Republic. And I could give a history of the attempt to retain a competency and to stamp the home on an emerging industrial, multi-ethnic, and multiracial society. And in doing so, I would track the history of the Gilded Age, which is partially what I do in the book. But it's also going to be a history of failure. The failure is foreshadowed in the funeral train that carried Lincoln home. The North that mourned Lincoln, the North of a competency, the North of a home, had won the Civil War. It had vanquished the South. It had fought against war against treason and slavery. It had ended the old plantation system. It had ended slavery. And it had remade the nation, they thought, in the version of the free labor North. But the irony is going to be that the North, in winning the Civil War, had destroyed the North as much as the South. The world I just described, the ideal world of a competency, the ideal world of a home, is going to be the world that is slowly going to vanish in the Gilded Age. A competency gave way to the triumph of wage labor. One of the things that makes the Gilded Age so foreign to us is at the beginning of it, people could not imagine a world in which most people earn their living by working for wages. By the end of it, they knew hardly any other world. Men lost their competency. But at the same time, women would seize the home. And the home, for a while, detached from a competency, would grow more and more powerful. The domestic space became a female space. But much of the 19th century is going to witness the expansion of the so-called imperial home. And what this is one of the most famous political cartoons of the 19th century, which of course is going to be plutocracy. But here what you're getting, most of these things say wages. They have reduced people to wages, and by reducing them to wages, wage workers, they have taken away their liberty. A few now dominate the many. What you're getting is the creation of what they feared as the dangerous classes, and the most dangerous class, of course, is going to be the very rich. But at the same time, what you're going to get is the expansion of the home. This is Frances Willard of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who I would argue is the most adroit politician in 19th century America and one of the more powerful. What she does is set a cultural agenda which is going to be built around the home, particularly in a phrase that she is going to use over and over again, home protection. She said the whole goal of her organization is to make the world, quote, more home-like. Instead of appealing to white manhood, as did the ideology of free labor, the WCTU implicitly sought protection for, quote, defenseless women and children against drunken men. A skilled and popular orator, Willard in 1876 had changed the title of her standard temperance lecture to Home Protection. She phrased her early demand for women's suffrage as a, quote, home protection ballot. Women needed the ballot because the WCTU needed government, local, state, and federal, to pass moral legislation. Willard believed deeply in the equality and the ability of women, but she believed equally deeply in the home, whose security depended on women's higher nature and protection of that higher nature from men who would attack the home. The WCTU used home protection to become a school for women's politics. Willard's famous slogan, "Do everything," initially referred to tactics and methods, and the causes grew every year. The WCTU is not just about temperance. It pushes school reform, free kindergarten, day nurseries for children and working women, federal aid to education. The organization had a whole section devoted to social evil reform, which ranged from Sabbatarian laws, which sought federal prohibition on interstate travel, on the Sabbath, and the movement of males, and all interstate commerce on Sundays, to censoring impure, obscene literature and promoting, quote, pure literature. Willard and the WCTU participated in the anti-polygamy campaign, which centered on the Mormons and defended beloved home religion. The organization campaigned to tighten divorce laws because divorce threatened the home. It advocated stronger laws against rape, attacked prostitution, and demanded the prosecution of male patrons. And it pushed laws governing the age of sexual consent, which were as low as 10 in 20 states and 7 in one state. The WCTU, by the end of the decade, advocated the 8-hour day and labor reform, and it did not confine itself to the United States. It spread across the English and French colonized world. Women became very powerful, even though they could not vote. But they could organize, boycott, march, and lobby. And Willard organized them around the protection of the home. The WCTU provided the maternal gateway to politics. But the gradual divorce of the home from a competency ended up disastrously. The tension between home and competence and capitalism had been present from the beginning. In the market, men struggled to gain a competence. Excuse me, I have to get the next slide. Men struggled to gain a competence, but this struggle could pit them against the home. Hamlin Garland provides the great account of the cost of this struggle. Hamlin Garland, particularly in his Son of the Middle Border, pits the home and homemaking against pioneering and business. He used the tension between the farm as a home and a business to criticize a set of male values: acquisitiveness, competition, ambition, the core values of classical liberalism that supposedly characterized the age. In the late 1870s and early 1880s, the Dakotas boomed. Among the boomers migrating to Dakota Territory were Dick Garland, Hamlin Garland's father, and his family. He had already moved them from Wisconsin to Minnesota, from Minnesota to Iowa. Hamlin later described this migration in The Son of the Middle Border. It's a memoir. A memoir, like all memoirs, takes actual people and turns them into literary characters. He turns his father, Dick Garland, into a literary character. In Iowa, environmental crisis in the form of cinch bugs had ruined the wheat crop, breaking Dick Garland's wheat buying business. And as the wheat turned yellow, Dick Garland began to look west. He turned his face towards the free lands of the farther west. He became again the pioneer. But his wife, Hamlin Garland's mother, did not want to go. The Garlands could have switched crops. That's what other people in Iowa did. But Dick Garland chose economic opportunity over the home. As Hamlin Garland wrote, quote, "Each of our lives was knit into those hedges and rooted in the fields, and yet notwithstanding all this, in response to some powerful yearning call, my father was about to set out for the 5th time into the still more remote and untrodden West." His quote, face again alight with the hope of the borderman, he took the train and staked out a homestead in Ordway, Brown County, Dakota, in the James River Valley. Garland, in a way, historians have not appreciated, and Garland may not have fully appreciated, had stumbled onto the critical failing of the Republican program. A set of policies designed to secure an expansion of the home, competency, and a market economy instead undermined the first two in favor of the third. The best way to see this is to fold Reconstruction into this larger attempt to expand free labor, competency in the home. One of the fundamental goals of Reconstruction, which is parallel with the Gilded Age, is to create a black home. And Thomas Nast's cartoons are wonderful because they can encapsulate the whole story in a single set of images. And what he does here is, this is the world of slavery, the world that's going to be left behind. This is the world of freedom, which is going to be emancipation, which is brought, of course, by Lincoln, the central figure of the age, which is going to be a world of schools, a world of savings, a world of work, but most of all, it's a world of a home. The black family would take its place alongside the white family. The black home would be a parallel of the white home. But the belief that all you had to do was provide free labor and this would come into being turned out to be false. Ending slavery and instituting free labor did not endow black men with either a competence or the ability to support a home. The people who recognized this most were the people who helped destroy it. The Klan and other terrorist organizations, the White Leagues and the Klan that you see here. And their target is, and again, they are very clear on what they're doing, is the black family and the black home. The Klan used its terror to send its message. Black men could not protect their homes, and black women could not be safe in their homes. The Klan preferred to whip its victims in their own front yards. They would whip men in front of their families to demonstrate their impotence and inability to protect home and family. Sometimes they went a step further and sexually mutilated them. When regulators attacked Eliza and Henry Pinkston's home in Louisiana in the mid-1870s, the whole idea of the black home was as much their target as the Pinkstons. This is what they did, and it's not unusual. They castrated Henry, mutilated him, and broke his ribs. They raped Eliza, cracked open her skull, slashed her, and cut her Achilles tendon. They killed the Pinkston's baby. The message could not have been clearer. Freed people could not have independent homes. Black men could not protect them. Black women could not live within them. And black parents could not reproduce children who would rise to be citizens of the Republic. Submission, social, political, and economic and sexual, was to be the only protection against these attacks. The final step was to show that not only were black men supposedly incapable of protecting their homes, but they were a threat to the white home. This eventually became the rationale of lynching. Lynching, executions by mobs or posses without official legal sanction, had been largely a Western phenomenon before the Civil War. By the 1880s and 90s, it is confined largely to the South. And no matter what the actual cause of the lynching, it was always going to be protected as a protection of white women and the white home against black assault and rape. In the 1890s, between 78 and 161 black men and boys died at the hands of mobs every single year, usually with public torture and mutilation. Ida Wells, a school teacher and black journalist in Memphis, Tennessee, published Southern lynch law in all its phases in 1892. She became the leading crusader against lynching. One of Frances Willard's lowest moments were her quarrels with Ida Wells and her failure to give a full-throated denunciation of lynching. Because at this point, the weakness of the home came into focus. The reason that Willard denounces Wells is that because people who engaged in lynching said they were protecting the home. And Willard accepted, at least in part, that rationale as a protection against the home. That the Klan, too, could become part of home protection. Home protection had become racialized, but it's a mistake, I think, only to see racism at work here. Garland was right. The pressures of American capitalism, and particularly industrial capitalism, meant that once home and competency were decoupled, once the two values were torn apart, some men could choose wealth over home, just as other men lost the ability to support the home and the gendered system of labor that it involved. Many Americans linked the loss of a competence to the loss of home, and like Willard, they went on to racialize it. The logic was most fully developed in the case of the Chinese. Xenophobia, strongest in the West Coast but present all over the United States, was framed as the inability of Chinese to have proper homes. These are Chinese in an opium den, why they can live on 40 cents a day, and why they're living on 40 cents a day threatens the American home. God bless our home. He could not support this in this wage, and so Chinese, willing to live outside the family, here you see them eating rats, become a danger to the American Republic because they're a danger to the American home. Quote, they crowd our men and families out of employment and have them lead them to want and destitution. They make hoodlums and criminals of our boys and drive our girls to worse than death by working for wages that for them means starvation. The logic went back to white manhood. And this kind of logic could extend further out. Once the home meant to be inclusive, to bring in black people, becomes the argument for why all kinds of other people cannot really be part of the Republic, because they cannot sustain homes, and indeed they attack homes. Buffalo Bill was personally sympathetic to Indians, but the Buffalo Bill's Wild West is all about Indian attacks and the defense of the white home. Over and over again, what you will find in the United States during this period is that to fall outside the realm of homes, I'll let that go for now, is to fall outside the realm of the Republic. If you can't maintain a home, if you can't protect the home, you are not really going to be an American citizen. And once that banner is there, it can apply to all kinds of groups. Tenements are not homes. The people who live in tenements are threats to the American Republic. that the home, cut apart from the idea of competence, has become an exclusive rather than an inclusive idea. Competence and home are a particular story, but one that is a more general application. And it comes back to what I said I was interested in at the beginning, the reconciliation of this pastness of the past with a different time in the present. Today we lack a concept of home as expansive or vital as that of the Gilded Age. We still use the word, but it doesn't mean the same thing to us. The idea of a competence no longer defines American economic ambitions. When I ask my class what they mean by an American dream, more often than not, and this might be distorted by teaching at Stanford, they imagine great wealth, not the ability to sustain yourself. They certainly do not think of the very rich as the dangerous classes. And we have similar conflicts with the failure of an American dream. It's not the defense of the home, but in many ways we use another word, once respectable, but now quite scary. We don't defend the home anymore, we defend the homeland. But we're defending it against people who are ranked with the kinds of people I was talking about in the 19th century. Now, one easy analysis is to think that this springs from our having abandoned once common values and going back to our proper values. Or saying that we've drifted into a kind of tribalism and we have no shared values. I don't think either one of those is true. Another argument is, well, there can't be any kind of shared values unless there's a general prosperity. And so what we really have to do is ensure a general prosperity. I don't think that's true. I don't think we can get out of the kinds of conditions we faced in the Gilded Age or the kinds of conditions we face today by either retreating to a past set of values or by arguing that the real goal is only economic prosperity. I'd like to suggest in closing something more complicated. First, I would suggest that all our values, whether they're economic or whether they're clearly cultural like the home, are cultural values. What we want our economy to do is a central question. 19th century Americans recognized this. They never thought the point of an economy was simply to produce the maximum amount of goods. The point of the economy was to sustain a republic, was to produce homes, was to allow people to gain a competency. But these values always come in constellations. We can't pick apart values. You can't pick one and leave others behind. The critical thing that happens in the United States is values that had once been stable because they were linked begin to decouple. In the same way that a constellation can drift away even though all the stars that made it up remain because they've come out of this old relationship, that can happen to American values. That if we think of our values as linkages, as things which we want to hold on to, but we can never hold on to them unless they maintain a relationship with something else, we might be able to have a far more fruitful analysis of what ails us. Because I don't think that looking at our worst moments, and looking at our moments not when we had the home, but when the home turns xenophobic, looking at the moments where in fact racism triumphs, reveals our true self. That's just the way we are. That analysis doesn't work either. What we have to do is why at some times when we can be xenophobic, when we can be racist, as we ended up sometimes being in the Gilded Age, why does that happen when at other times it didn't? And the argument, it seems to me, is because something got out of whack. Not something simple, something complicated. That a set of things that rested against each other, that existed in a relationship, begin to change. And the hard analysis, when you analyze the Gilded Age, as I've tried to do, and seeing how the home and competence, once they drift out, can turn the home into a very different kind of concept. Something like that, I think, is going on today. Something like that takes place when perfectly decent values environmental protection, public safety, equal opportunity, fairness, can be mobilized for not perfectly decent ends. Understanding how that happens is the challenge. And I think the Gilded Age, and looking at things like competence and home and how they drifted apart in some parallel way, might give us a key to try to understand where we are today. Thank you.
Anyone has any questions?
So the backdrop here with the industrialization of the North for prosecution of the war unleashed a whole set of industrial technological capabilities, which then played in the next 30 or 40 years. How do you see that affecting your basic thesis about home versus alternative?
This is a time of incredible technological progress. This is going to be a time where, in fact, the American economy is growing very rapidly in terms of its gross domestic product. The question was, does this help individual people? Does it allow them to establish homes? And there's a large long argument among economists about this. And what I did is I cut out of that, because it's virtually impossible to get adequate statistics, but there's one thing which is pretty well measured in the 19th century. How big were people? When did they die? And how long did they live? And one of the things that economists and demographers have found is there is a decline that picks up in about the 1830s and continues to the 1880s and 1890s, where in general, Americans live shorter lives, they get smaller, their children continue to die in large numbers, and the conditions of life get worse. As they would translate it, and they did translate it, how can we have proper homes in this kind of atmosphere? That became the argument against the tenements. The tenements are not homes. People are sick, they die. Look at the people who live in them. And this becomes an argument that for 30 or 40 years, I mean, there are times in American history which, as much as we hate to believe it, for the mass of people, things sometimes get worse. It doesn't last for the whole period, but this, the late Gilded Age, was going to be one of those periods. And they understand it in terms of the home. And they blame it on a whole series of things. There are housing reformers who see it as material, but one thing is, it's the problem of the people who themselves live in those homes. The immigrants themselves are the cause of why they live in tenements. The Chinese are the cause of why they work for 40 cents a day. And that becomes the kind of analysis that kicks in, but they are not missing the real situation, which is the kinds of things they had associated with the standard American life are changing. And it's one of the things which I simply didn't fully recognize, and I think many historians haven't, though demographers and economists have been looking at this now for 10 or 15 years.
Thank you very much. This was an incredible talk, and I look forward to reading the book. So my question is on whether, with the decoupling of home and of competency, if there's sort of an eradication of Republican values and virtues, or if there's some sort of transformation of Republican values and virtues. So I have in the back of my mind a recent book by Alex Gorovich, From Slavery to the Cooperative Commonwealth, wherein he looks at how Republican virtue in the industrialization after Reconstruction might sort of leave room for solidarity taking the place of Republican virtue and sort of mutual dependency replacing independency with the labor movement, and particularly with the Knights of Labor. So I'm curious if with this, again, decoupling, if there's sort of a loss of Republican virtues, or if there's sort of, if it might appear in other places in American political thought at this time.
Well, I mean, one of the things in writing the book that I was most impressed with was the creativity of American political thinking in the 19th century. And they go pretty much along the line you've sketched out. There's going to be the Knights of Labor. There's going to be the Farmers Alliance. There's going to be the Grangers. And the easiest way to summarize all these groups is they began to argue that some sort of cooperation, some sort of cooperative society is going to have to come in. And by cooperation, they could sometimes mean corporate and sometimes mean corporation, and replace what goes on. The Knights of Labor, they are not turning back the clock. Americans are not Luddites. They do not disavow technology. But the argument is, how does this technology get turned into a way that can produce the old ends, produce Republican citizens, sustain homes? And this is what all these organizations were about. So we don't usually think of the Gilded Age this way, but it was a great age of social reform. There are social reform organizations everywhere. They're the politics, and we think about labor being crushed by capital. It was a big fight, but until the 1880s, 1890s, labor mostly holds its own. This is going to be a period of great contest in American society, but one of the things Americans do is have no trouble envisioning what a future is going to look like. They might fail to get it, but it's, again, one of the differences between now. I do not, and I just could be tone deaf because sometimes you are in the middle of things, I do not hear anybody enunciating what a future American society is going to look like. All I hear people talking about is how to go back to a past. That's not what they did in the 19th century. The 19th century, they thought they could envision a world which would take in everything that had changed, but somehow maintain the values they thought they had secured in 1865, 1866.
Yeah, I have a somewhat similar sort of question. I was interested in pushing a little bit more on the political dimensions of this dynamic of home and competency. And, it seemed to me in your talk you alluded to home and competency and their relationship to notions of civic belonging. But I was wondering if you could say more about their relations to notions of democracy and of sort of the imagined paths towards meaningful political participation, which I think you've just discussed in terms of the possibilities of cooperation. I was wondering if you could say more about sort of the possibilities for meaningful political participation in the 19th century imagination, and also maybe where does that leave us in the 21st century imagination?
Okay. In the 19th century, all of these things are going to have, in our eyes, pluses and minuses. The goal is, because you imagine a home as the basis of it, and you imagine a home based on the existing free labor home, that means every other group in the United States will be merged into a homogeneous citizenry. So what you will get, all American citizens will be the same no matter where you are, but you will ascribe to a same set of values. You can maintain differences, but your core sense of having a set of political rights, maintaining the home, attaining a competency is going to be spread across the whole society. When this begins to break down, when there's large numbers of people who haven't attained a competency, that's where things get dicey. The argument is some people say, well, we have to expand the system to bring in it so everybody can get the old equivalent of a competency, or at least what replaces it, the American standard of living, or are we seeing that a lot of people simply cannot be Americans? And by the 1880s, 1890s, where it's going is towards exclusion. Whole sets of groups are being marked out as un-American simply because, and the key was always there in Lincoln. Remember, the thing Lincoln says, anybody can attain a competency unless. In the late 19th century, that unless is coming in. Why are they poor? It's the poor's fault. Why are we having these conditions in cities? It's immigrant. All of these things can be used as exclusion. And that's the tragic trajectory of the period. But both options were always open. People were battling between them. So the politics of this can turn in a lot of different ways. And it's an old question, is what does it mean to be an American and what counts as an American?
The way you describe Americans during the Gilded Age, they're very introverted, concentrating mostly on themselves, and that sort of jives with the tradition that associates 1898, the end of the age, with the advent of imperialism and the Americans first starting to think of themselves as international or having a role to play in the international community, whereas today that's one of the great back and forth debates about in politics. So how much do Americans think about themselves as a nation in relation to others in this time?
Americans in the late 19th century think about it as an expanding nation. And there's a real link between what becomes imperialism later on. Because remember, at the end of the Civil War, the United States claimed but really did not control half the country. And part of the book takes up that what we're doing is to bring in the West, and that's part of a greater Reconstruction, involves the conquest of the West and bringing people in. One of the reasons why Americans do not engage in the kind of imperialism which characterizes the 20th century is they're doing that at home. It's bringing in places which they have not yet controlled. And they're always connected with the world. I mean, they see the development as the United States as central, but we are a nation, which is, I guess we've just taken it off our slogans, whatever official slogans we have. We are a nation of immigrants. Immigrants are a larger and larger part of it. We are developing quickly. We import European ideas. We're connected, but we're not imperial in the sense of going abroad, but we are imperial in the sense of being at home.